Okay, quick question. If I told you that 14 wolves, just 14, were responsible for changing the course of rivers in Yellowstone National Park, you'd probably say I'd been spending too much time on the internet. And fair, but this actually happened. In 1995, the U.S. government dropped a handful of gray wolves, Canis lupus, into Yellowstone's Lamar Valley, a place they hadn't been seen in over 70 years. And what happened next? Scientists like William Ripple at Oregon State are still kind of losing their minds about it. Because those wolves didn't just change the park, they changed the rivers. Physically, the actual geography of the land. This is the story of how 14 animals accidentally fixed an entire ecosystem, and what it tells us about the planet's ability to bounce back when we just let it. Also, there are some very dramatic elk involved. You'll see. Let's go back to the early 1900s. Yellowstone, America's first national park, over 2 million acres of wilderness, had a wolf problem. At least that's what people thought. Wolves were seen as dangerous, a threat to livestock on surrounding farms. So the government did what governments do when they think something is a problem. They got rid of it. By 1926, wolves had been completely wiped out from Yellowstone, and for a while, nobody noticed anything weird. The park looked fine, beautiful even. Tourists kept coming. Rocky Mountain elk were everywhere. But here's the thing about ecosystems. They're basically giant Jenga towers. Pull out the right block and the whole thing gets wobbly. Over the next few decades, scientists started noticing something troubling. The vegetation along Yellowstone's rivers was disappearing. Riverbanks were eroding. Certain species of trees, willows, aspens, cottonwoods, were being absolutely decimated. The culprit? The elk. With no wolves around, elk populations had exploded. And with no predator to fear, the elk just ate everything. They'd hang out by the rivers all day, grazing without a care in the world, completely destroying the vegetation through what ecologists call browse pressure. Imagine having an all-you-can-eat buffet with no consequences. That was the elk's entire life. Good for them, bad for the river. So by the early 1990s, scientists had been watching this slow-motion disaster for decades and finally convinced the government to try something radical, bring the wolves back. In January 1995, 14 gray wolves were captured in Canada and released into Yellowstone's Lamar Valley through what would become the Yellowstone Wolf Project. There were protests. Farmers were furious. Some people thought it was insane. 14 wolves into a 2-million-acre park. What could they possibly do? Everything, it turns out. At first, the changes were exactly what you'd expect. Wolf populations started growing. They began hunting elk. Elk numbers dropped, standard predator-prey stuff. Scientists were pleased, but not exactly shocked. But then something unexpected happened, something that changed how we understand ecosystems entirely. The elk didn't just get fewer, they got scared. See, when you have a predator in the area, a real, genuine, please don't eat me predator, you change your behavior. The elk stopped hanging out in open valleys and along riverbanks where wolves could easily catch them. They started moving, staying alert, avoiding certain areas altogether. What ecologists call the landscape of fear had been reestablished, and the areas they abandoned started to recover almost immediately. Here's where it gets genuinely mind-blowing. Within just a few years of the wolves returning, the vegetation along Yellowstone's rivers exploded back to life. Willows that hadn't grown tall in decades started shooting up. Aspens came back. Riverbanks stabilized as plant roots held the soil in place. And when the plants came back, so did everyone else. Beavers, who need willows to survive, started returning to rivers they hadn't inhabited in years. Beavers build dams. Dams create ponds. Ponds create habitats for otters, muskrats, fish, ducks, and amphibians. Bears started eating the berries that grew on the recovered shrubs. Songbirds returned to nest in the new trees. Hawks and eagles had more prey. Ravens and foxes followed the wolves, feeding on the remains of their kills. An entire web of life, species that hadn't been seen in Yellowstone for decades, came back, because 14 wolves scared some elk away from a riverbank. But here's the part that made my jaw actually drop when I first read about this. The rivers themselves stabilized and reformed. I'm serious. The physical geography of Yellowstone, where the rivers flow, how wide they are, how they bend, shifted because of the wolves. Because with stabilized riverbanks, the rivers stopped eroding and meandering chaotically. They narrowed, deepened, and ran cleaner. The channels became more fixed. Water quality improved. The rivers literally reformed themselves. Scientists have a name for this. They call it a trophic cascade. When a change at the top of the food chain ripples all the way down, affecting everything, including the physical landscape itself. And Yellowstone is now considered the most dramatic example of a trophic cascade ever recorded. Now look, I'm not here to tell you everything in nature is sunshine and wolf cuddles. Conservation is complicated and wolf reintroduction has real costs for farmers and communities nearby. That's a real tension, and it deserves respect. But here's what this story tells me, and why I think it matters beyond just being a cool nature fact. The natural world has an astonishing ability to recover. When we remove the pressure, even just a little, things start to heal in ways we didn't predict, and frankly, don't fully understand yet. 14 wolves changed rivers. Imagine what's possible at scale. There are now over 100 wolves in Yellowstone. The park's ecosystem health metrics are at their best levels in a century. Other countries have started their own rewilding programs. Wolves back in parts of Europe, lynx being proposed for reintroduction in Scotland's Highlands, wild horses returning to Central Asia. The planet is resilient in ways that should genuinely give us hope. And yes, I realize I just made you emotional about wolves. You're welcome. That's kind of the whole point of this channel. Yellowstone wasn't a fluke, and that's what makes this story bigger than one park in Wyoming. While researchers were still piecing together what had happened in Lamar Valley, the same pattern was already playing out across Central Europe. Gray wolves reintroduced to parts of the continent in the mid-1990s produced results that mirrored Wyoming almost exactly. Deer shifted their behavior, vegetation came back along riverbanks, and erosion slowed without anyone planting a single tree or moving a single stone. Different continent, different species, and the result was essentially identical. Mozambique tells an even starker version of the same story. A civil war that ended in 1992 had stripped Gorongosa National Park of over 90% of its large mammals, with hippos, lions, and elephants either killed or driven out entirely, and what remained was a ghost of an ecosystem. Rewilding efforts began reintroducing species through the 2000s, and Gorongosa today holds one of the fastest recovering ecosystems ever documented anywhere on Earth. Lion populations grew tenfold, elephants returned, and the vegetation along the park's rivers transformed in ways that tracked almost perfectly with what Yellowstone had shown a decade earlier. The ocean ran the same experiment in the 1990s when sea otters were reintroduced along parts of the North American Pacific coast after hunting had pushed them to the edge of extinction. Otters eat sea urchins, and sea urchins left to multiply without a predator consume kelp forests down to bare rock. When the otters came back, the kelp recovered, and fish populations, seals, and coastal eagles followed in sequence. An entire shoreline ecosystem that had been unraveling for decades pulled itself back together because one animal returned to do its job. 3 continents, 3 completely different sets of species. The pattern held every time. What all of these places confirm is something that Yellowstone first made impossible to ignore. Nature doesn't need us to rebuild it from scratch. What it needs is for us to stop removing the pieces that hold everything else in place, or in some cases, to put one of those pieces back and then get out of the way. Ecosystems carry something like a blueprint of what they were, and given any real opportunity, they move back toward it with a kind of stubborn, quiet determination that scientists are still working to fully understand. 14 wolves carried that blueprint back into Yellowstone in 1995, and the rivers eventually followed their lead. If you want to go deeper on this, and you should because it only gets wilder, look up the term trophic cascade. The research from Yellowstone is incredible. This channel exists because I got absolutely exhausted by doom-scrolling the news every morning. The world is genuinely, measurably getting better in 1,000 ways that never make headlines, so we're going to cover them. If that sounds like something you need in your life, and statistically we all do, hit subscribe. And leave a comment telling me the last good news story that actually made your day. I read them all. I'll see you next week with something just as good, maybe better.